I want to continue our Bible study series this evening on the law, and we have looked at several different aspects. We looked at an introduction to the law. We went through last time different categories of God's law. We looked and saw that there are physical laws in the Bible, there are spiritual laws in the Bible, there are civil laws and statutes, there are ceremonial laws and regulations in the Bible. We looked also last time to see which categories of the law are not applicable in the New Testament period. And we saw that basically the New Testament summarizes very clearly that one is the ceremonial aspects of the law no longer are to be directly applied in the New Testament. That's what we're told in Hebrews. These things, the things which stood only in the meat offerings, the drink offerings, the different washings, and the various physical ceremonies, that those things were imposed until the time of Reformation. They were temporary, imposed upon the congregation of Israel until the time of Messiah. That's one category of law. We saw in Hebrews, that's in Hebrews 9. In Hebrews 7, we saw that there was a change of the law regarding the priesthood, and that was specifically spelled out, that the laws pertaining to the priesthood of Aaron and all the things connected with that in terms of to whom goes the tithe and all of the specific regulations relating to the priesthood, there's a change of the law regarding the priesthood because there's a change of the priesthood. We're under today the Melchizedek priesthood, which is Jesus Christ. And so that was the second category of laws that were changed. And the third category of laws were spelled out there in 1 Corinthians by the Apostle Paul, or rather 2 Corinthians, that the administration of death, that we no longer administer the death penalty, that we are under the administration of the Spirit, and it is a different civil administration. So we see that there are really only three categories of laws that do not apply in a very direct way. We also saw that Jesus Christ came to magnify the law and to emphasize the spirit and intent of the law, which brings us to part of what I want to cover this evening, which is the difference in approach between regarding the law in the New Testament and the way the law came to be regarded among the Jews. When people read the New Testament, and they read the gospel encounters that Christ had with the Pharisees, there are those who come away with the idea that somehow Christ was against the law, that the Pharisees were upholding the law and Christ was doing away with the law. And that, of course, is not the case at all. Jesus said very clearly, very plainly in Matthew chapter 5, we had seen this at the beginning of the Bible study series, Matthew 5:17, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill, to fill it up to the full." Jesus Christ did not come to tear it down. He came to magnify it, to enhance it, to make the full intent and purpose clear. Now, the Pharisees had a different approach to the law. Their approach, let's just notice their approach summed up by Christ in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 1, "Then spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They sat in the seat of judgment. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not you after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Their works they do to be seen of men." And he talks about their approach. Their approach to the law was based on outward show. Christ was not attacking in any way or undermining the law that God gave in the Old Testament, because who was the God of the Old Testament? Jesus Christ, we're told very clearly in 1 Corinthians that in 1 Corinthians 10:4, that rock which followed them, that spiritual rock followed them, and that rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians 10:4. The spiritual rock that followed Israel, the rock of Israel, was Jesus Christ. He was the one that led them through the wilderness. That spiritual rock that followed them, that rock was Christ. So He was the one that gave them the laws, the statutes, the judgments, the 10 Commandments. He certainly didn't come to do away with, quote, His Father's commandments, and He didn't come to do away with what He Himself had given. But let's notice here, I have a book, and I want to read you just a few quotes from, and the title of it is The Essential Talmud. Now, just to read you here from the introduction, it says, it's impossible to understand either Judaism or the Jews themselves, either the system of Jewish belief and practice, without a basic understanding of the Talmud. It is a sacred text and an actual code of law for the governing of civic life. It is the fullest expression of Jewish attitudes and traditions. You see, in many ways, the Talmud is the most important book in Jewish culture. Now, you might have thought that the Bible was the most important book. Well, the Bible certainly should be the most important book. But the Talmud is the most important book in Jewish culture. No other work has had a comparable influence on the theory and practice of Jewish life. Now, that ought to tell you something, because the Bible is what we should be able to say of the Bible that no other book other than the Bible, no book other than the Bible has had a comparable influence on the theory and practice of our life, of the Christian life. But they readily admit, this was written by a leading rabbi, that no other book has had a comparable influence on the theory and practice of the Jewish life. Now, what is the Talmud? Well, the formal definition of the Talmud is that it is the summary of oral law that evolved after centuries of scholarly efforts by sages who lived in Palestine and Babylonia up until the beginning, even stretching on down to the beginning of the Middle Ages. What it really amounts to is it is a repository of the oral law. And the Jews regarded the oral law, now I say the Jews, the Pharisees regarded the oral law as just as significant as the written law. It goes through and deals with all sorts of things, and the point is that much of what is brought out in the Talmud, and I may share a few excerpts of it from you with you, are the things that Jesus Christ was addressing and dealing with when He dealt with the Pharisees. The problem, what Jesus Christ expressed, was not a disagreement with the laws of the Bible and the Old Testament. But you see, the Pharisees had bound heavy burdens, grievous to be borne. Their approach to the law was to invent all sorts of human ideas of do's and don'ts that you can't find if you just read the Bible. But they came up with ideas that in their mind carried the law further out. And they gradually developed it. It was something that developed over a period of time. You see, Jesus over and over told them that they were in reality willing to lay aside the law of God so that they may keep their own traditions. In Mark chapter 7, let's pick up the account in verse 1. Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, That is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. Now, in my Bible, by the word defiled in verse 2 is a little number 4. And in the margin it says, or common. They saw the disciples eat bread with common hands, or unwashed hands, defiled hands. Now, what did they mean by that? Was the problem the fact that they said, people ought to wash their hands before they eat? No. They had made a tradition, as we're going to see, that had to do with a particular manner of washing hands. Their problem was that you may have come in contact with something that was ceremonially unclean, particularly you may have brushed against a Gentile. And so your hands had to be washed because this would somehow condemn any of the food. You don't find that in the Old Testament. You find that in the tradition that they had. So they saw the disciples eat bread with defiled hands, that is to say, unwashed hands. And the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they washed their hands often, or again in little number 5 out by the word oft in my Bible, and in the margin it says, or diligently in the original, with the fists up to the elbow. That's what it literally means. They had a manner that they went in and they washed it up to the elbow, and they held them up and they let them drip, and they had a particular manner of washing hands. It wasn't just a matter of washing your hands, except they washed their hands diligently up to the elbow. They wouldn't eat. Where did they get this? Holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not, and many other things there be, which they have received to hold as the washings of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tablets. Then the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why walk not your disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands? And he said, well, as Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups and many other such like things you do. And he said, full well, you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your own tradition. Oh, the problem was that they elevated tradition above God's law. They elevated the tradition above God's law, and they came up with all sorts of things that were there. Let me just read you a little bit here concerning a couple of things. Let me read you a little bit concerning the Sabbath. Again, I'm reading from this Jewish publication, the Essential Talmud. The basic view of the Sabbath as a day of rest appears very simple, but it arouses a number of problems when put into practice. Oh, first and foremost, it is necessary to establish the definition of labor. Oh, so they had to decide what labor is. The oral tradition goes on to say, the oral tradition comments on this, and that the statement in the Bible, they said, well, the prohibition is not related to the definition of labor or to the payment of money, but to the injunction to refrain from acts of deliberate creation in the physical world. The children of Israel are called upon to refrain from creative work on this day. So then they went on and said that they looked at the tabernacle, since that they weren't to work on the tabernacle. That was specifically forbidden. And so they analyzed the categories of basic activity carried out during the construction of the tabernacle and summed up a list of 39 basic labors, prototypes of the work forbidden and permitted on the Sabbath. Each of these 39 basic categories of labor has its offspring. that different in detail. So it says, for instance, they came to the conclusion that writing is forbidden on the Sabbath. What are the significant limits of writing? They decided that 2 letters constituted a significant unit, so that the writing of more than 1 letter would be regarded as work in the fullest sense of the word. Okay, the work that does not call for mental effort is not creative. A man who carries out a certain action unthinkingly and later discovered he's created something is not engaging in work, since his efforts lack the component of intention. And so various ways of doing that, so they came to the conclusion that, according to one rabbi, that a man who intended to pick a certain bunch of grapes and picked another bunch instead had not been truly working, even if as far as he was concerned there was no practical difference between them. Now, commerce as such does not belong within the general framework of creative work, since whatever it produces is not physically evident. So then they had problems with that. There was a prohibition against the handling of certain objects and utensils that were related to work forbidden on the Sabbath. Goes on in the general sense, the numerous Sabbath laws are an expanding network of minute detail deriving from several basic concepts which eventually create an almost Gothic structure made up of thousands upon thousands of tiny and meticulously fashioned details clustered around the original form. Now, the point is, what Jesus Christ was commenting on in the New Testament was not downplaying the importance of keeping the Sabbath. What he was commenting upon was the thousands upon thousands of tiny, meticulously fashioned details that were the tradition of the elders that did not constitute the fact. You get into all sorts of things. So we find that the laws of ritual purity and impurity take up a whole order of the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, even more than sacrificial law. And they go into the laws of purity are essentially a complex, unified network, interrelated, and it goes in. The Talmud devoted considerable space to them, offered no explanations. And they managed to, well, to show you the extreme that they go to on some of these things. So there were all sorts of just details that they created in their own process of developing really their law apart from the Bible. I think it's important to understand that many of the things that are practiced by the Jews go way beyond what God ever decided or intended. Because the principle that Christ gave, the process, is not a matter of some intricate reasoning to come up with some complicated formula. It is a simple, basic approach. The law is a statement of principles, of guidelines, of things that are to direct our path. It can direct our path in physical matters. It can direct our path in spiritual matters. It can direct our path in civil matters or in ceremonial matters. Now, the ceremonial, I intend to go through some of that in a later Bible study in this series, because there are many lessons that were contained there, and I think it's good for us to go through. And one of the things we'll see is, of course, that you cannot divide the law clearly into these categories with no overlap. many of the physical. How do you divide physical and spiritual? Now, on one level, we know there are physical principles that God has set in motion. We're physical creatures. But you know, if you think about it, the Ten Commandments, based upon God's great spiritual law of love, that's spiritual. But when the commandment says, thou shalt not steal, that is prohibiting a physical action. When it says, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not commit adultery, those involve spiritual sins, but they also involve physical actions. Ultimately, everything we do is physical. On the other hand, there are physical things, physical prohibitions against eating certain things, for instance. And yet, when you go through the law, in Leviticus, it makes it plain. God says, don't eat this because you are to be a holy people unto me. You are to be separate, and I want you to recognize that you are separate and distinct from all the nations. And so you make a distinction in terms of what you eat and don't eat. So God uses physical things to teach spiritual principles, and spiritual laws regulate our physical conduct. So there is a certain interaction. There are ceremonial aspects sometimes to laws that were basically physical in nature, laws of sanitation, hygiene, diet, things of that sort, and yet there were often ceremonial aspects that were to use those physical principles to inculcate certain spiritual concepts as well. So you find that sometimes the civil statutes involved also were based upon physical principles that God had set in motion. So there is an interrelationship. Ultimately, the basis of all of God's law is the law of love. God is love. That's God's basic nature, most basic character. And the laws that are spiritual are the laws that relate to the interrelationship of man and his neighbor and man and his God. You see, Christ summarized the law as saying that, as we saw back here in Matthew, we didn't read it, we read in Matthew 23, but in Matthew 22, in verse 36, a lawyer asked him, what is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is likened to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So the summation of God's basic law is love. Love toward God, love toward neighbor. The Apostle Paul tells us, speaking of the law, that the law is spiritual. That he tells us that in Romans chapter 7 and verse 12, that the law is holy, the commandment is holy and just and good. In verse 14 of Romans 7, he says, we know the law is spiritual. In verse 22, he calls it the law of God. He says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. So, the law is spiritual. There is a great spiritual law of love toward God and love toward neighbor. And ultimately, the principles of God's law, the detailed principles of God's law, are an amplification of how you express love toward God and how you express love toward neighbor. You see, even the ceremonial laws were to teach them lessons about a relationship with God, which involves love toward God. Even the civil statutes were to teach them and to regulate the interaction of neighbors. The way that, because when you get even down to regulating property and regulating crime and punishment, you're regulating the way that neighbors deal with one another. There was an application given to a civil nation, given to a carnal nation. It was not being called to repentance and conversion. But there, again, was that principle. Even the physical laws have a certain application or connection. Now, we say physical laws because we recognize that God is the great lawgiver, that there are principles of cause and effect. There are things that are designed to work and function in a particular way, and things that are designed not to work and function in another way. When we are introduced, for instance, back in the book of Genesis to the time of the flood and to Noah and the instructions that God gave Noah, he told Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 19, of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shall you bring on the ark to keep them alive, the male and his female. Of fowls after their kind, the creeping thing, 2 of every sort. And you shall take unto you of all food that is eaten, and it is to be this. So he was commanded to make this ark. And coming on down in chapter 7, verse 2, of every clean beast, you shall take to you by sevens, the male and female, and his female. And of beasts that are not clean, by 2, the male and his female. The fowls also of the air, by sevens, the male and his female, to keep the seed alive upon the face of all the earth. Now, what do we find? We find that there was a knowledge of clean and unclean all the way back at the time of Noah. Moses did not invent clean and unclean. There was a distinction of clean and unclean meats before the ceremonial law, before the priesthood of Aaron was ever developed. There were principles that God had established from creation. God is the creator. He designed certain things for certain functions. Now, God could have very easily made all animal flesh good to eat. He could have made, he could have made animals like plants. Basically, if it tastes good, it's, okay to eat it. And if it, usually the things that, have people, God doesn't give you a list of plants in the Bible that are unclean plants, yet, we know certainly that there are plants that aren't good to eat. A person wouldn't go out and make a salad out of poison ivy leaves, at least not more than once probably. There's a very immediate effect. And so people know that and they stay clear of it. The point is, God did not make animal flesh in quite that way. If he did, then most of the population of the world, and certainly most of the population of this part of the country, would have, all of us probably sitting here, and myself included, I think back some of the things I ate growing up and go out in the woods and if, you could kill it and bring it home, well, you eat it. And, you think about some of those things and just is sort of revolting when you consider what you used to put in your mouth. But, we thought it was okay. And you know what? I didn't keel over dead when I ate catfish or pig or squirrel mulligan stew or whatever it was. Any of the various things, and I can think of a few worse than some of those, if you categorize some as being worse than the others. The point is, God gave us instruction. Now, God could have made it to where either all flesh was fine to eat, or there was some obvious physical distinction so much that you take one bite and you spit it out and say, oh, that's horrible. That's got to be poison, There's certain vegetation is that way, all somebody's got to do is try to take a bite of it and find out, the animals don't even eat that. You steer clear of it. But God did not choose to do it that way. Now, he did design certain animals to be consumed and others not to. But We are dependent on the instructions God gives us. Now, when we look at those instructions, there are some things we can figure out. If you know some of these things are not fit to eat, and you begin to do some research and some study into it, you can find that there are certain problems and certain complications with it. There are certain diseases that come as a result of certain unclean animals. There are certain health problems that are connected to the eating of blood and fat. But, how much of various sausages and boudin and things like that have people eaten, and at least temporarily, they survive to tell the tale. Loaded up with all the things God says don't put in there. It's almost like somebody went through, got a list of the things they weren't supposed to put in, and dumped all that. But God has regulated it so that we're forced to make a distinction between the clean and the unclean in life, and that we are continually coming in contact with both, and we're having to choose one and reject the other. Now, they're physical matters, but God has designed it that way to also teach us a spiritual point. That as we go through life, we're continually coming in contact with clean and unclean. Clean and unclean actions, clean and unclean thoughts. We are being trained that we need to be conscious of always in every facet of our life making a distinction between the clean and the unclean. Rejecting the unclean, choosing the clean. God designed it that way. It would have been very simple, if you're creating, God could have given every mammal the digestive system of a cow. Why couldn't a catfish have had the same digestive system of a bass or a perch? Well, they don't. Why did God do it? Why did He make that distinction? Well, He chose to, and He chose to put us in that situation. Now let's look at some of the physical laws. Let's look, for instance, at the laws of clean and unclean meats. We go back to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. We have the regulation. I have, by the way, and any of you are welcome to it, a listing of biblically clean fish. Usually the question comes up with fish more frequently than it comes up with other animals, because most of the others are fairly simple. Most of the time when you get fish, unless there's something you catch locally, if you buy them, you don't know whether they had scales or fins or what. So if any of you would like this, I have a listing here of clean and unclean fish, or of the clean fish. Then down at the bottom it lists a list of the unclean. Of the unclean fish. In Leviticus 11, in verse 2, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts that you may eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever parts the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the beasts, that shall you eat. So, very simple. It divides the hoof and chews the cud. Then he specifically spells out, these shall you not eat. Because some of them chew the cud, but they don't divide the hoof, and some of them divide the hoof, but don't chew the cud. And so it spells out various animals here, including the camel, or the coney, or the little rock badger, the hare, or rabbit, the pig, and it just spells some out that they were familiar with. And it says in verse 8, of their flesh shall you not eat, and their carcass shall you not touch. They are unclean to you. In verse 9, these shall you eat of all that are in the waters. Whatsoever has fins and scales in the waters, in the season in the rivers, them shall you eat. All that have not fins and scales of all that move in the waters shall be an abomination. And you're not to eat their flesh. You shall have their carcasses an abomination. Verse 11, whatsoever has no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination to you. So he goes through. He does not give a detailed listing. He simply says fins and scales. And this listing goes through that. And then these are they which you shall have an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. And it goes through and lists various ones: the eagle, the vulture, the raven, the owl, the nighthawk, the various kinds of owls and things of this sort. And we find that there were there's basically a listing of the things not to eat. And from that, of course, we deduce the others that are available to eat, such as the chicken, the duck, the turkey, the goose, the various birds that are mentioned even elsewhere as being utilized in sacrifices. These various categories of birds. Birds generally aren't as much of a problem. There are obviously some of these birds here that these are not, let's say, the things that are normally eaten by most here. And then there were even certain creeping things of the locust or grasshopper family, a certain type that were also permissible. And it says in verse 24, for these you shall be unclean. Whosoever touches the carcass of them shall be unclean until the evening. Whosoever bears any of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Now, again, the principle here are physical principles of health. God set certain animals, and you find a dead one, well, it died of something. And so here are physical principles. Here are physical laws. God says you go out and you touch something like that, you've gotten it on you, you need to wash. Now, we tend to take some of these things for granted because we live in a society where water is rather plentiful, and it's a fairly simple matter to throw something in the washing machine. But if you had to carry water from a distance in a bucket or a pot, and you had to go down to the creek and wash your clothes, the tendency would be to sort of skimp on washing clothes and taking baths. And some of us remember when we didn't have running water, and there wasn't some of what people take for granted today. The frequency of bathing wasn't quite so simple, wasn't quite so easy, a Saturday night, whether you needed it or not, and sort of sponge off in between. Clothes were not as frequently washed. If you got to take them out and boil them in the old wash pot, you got to use a scrub board and eagle eye soap, and that becomes quite a chore. And the point that I'm making is that we take for granted many of these principles that are spelled out here. God spelled them out. They were matters of physical health. They were matters of sanitation. They were matters of hygiene. God spelled them out. He says you're unclean. It just means you're dirty. You're unclean. You need to clean up until you come before you come back in. Speaking there of the camp, and there were also restrictions that were there. It wasn't a crime to touch these animals. He just said you're unclean. You need to wash. You need to clean up. You need to wash your clothes. And that when you come in contact with these things, you need to be washed. And so he goes through, and that goes into all of the great distinction in verse 29. These shall also be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep on the earth. The weasel, the mouse, the tortoise, verse 30, the ferret, the chameleon, the lizard, the snail, the mole. These are unclean unto you among all that creep. Whosoever does touch them, when they be dead, shall be unclean until the evening. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, does fall, it shall be unclean. And whether it be a vessel or of wood or raiment or skin or sack or whatever vessel it is, it's unclean. It must be put in the water. It shall be unclean until the evening, so shall it be cleansed. In an earthen vessel where any of them fall, it is unclean and you break it. You know, if it was cloth or if it was metal, you could take it out and scrub it and wash it, and it was fine. What would happen if you had a earthen pottery? You know, the porous. You ever seen porous pottery vessels? You know, the kind that a lot of times you get in Mexico or something of that sort. They often use that in cooking. What happens if you find something crawled up in there and died? What do you do with it? God said, don't take it down and wash it, just break it. You know, and they were fairly simple to replace. You know, if there's no big deal, but there's no way you can really cleanse something like that. He didn't go through and explain to them all about germs and bacteria, but if something crawled up in there and died, you couldn't scrub it. You couldn't get it clean because it's porous and it just it would contaminate whatever came into it later. You may get sick, you may not, but God says, look, that's unclean. It can't be scrubbed out in a way that if you had something of iron or even something cloth or any of the other things that he mentioned here that could be clean. And so he talks about these things in verse 35. The ovens are ranges for pots broken down. And that's again talking about the ovens that they used were normally clay ovens. You know, that they constructed. They still often use them in the Middle East. They're simply sun-dried clay. They were utilized. That's what they put the bread on and things like that. He says, if something unclean gets in there and comes in contact with it, you just break it and get you another, make you another. That does not, from a practical standpoint, most of this doesn't apply to most of us because that's not what we normally use to cook in. You know, we tend to use glass and porcelain and metal and things of that sort to cook in. So those things it's permissible simply to wash, as was spelled out up here a little earlier. But the things that were clay. And he talks about water, for instance, a fountain or a pit, verse 36, if there's plenty of water, it'll be clean. That which touches their carcass shall be unclean. In other words, if you found some dead animal down here in the pool, you don't drink the water that's in the pool, but if it's a running spring, well, it hasn't contaminated the source of the spring. So God gave them instructions relating to hygiene, relating to sanitation. He says if it's fallen among sowing seed, that's okay. You can go ahead and plant the seed. That hasn't hurt the seed. So he goes through and gives detailed instructions. And so he says in verse 43, you shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, neither shall you make yourselves unclean with them, that you shall be defiled thereby, for I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. I am the Eternal that brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl and of every living thing that moves in the waters and of every creature that creeps upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. You see, God purposely designed things so that we are confronted with the need to make a difference, to make a distinction. Now, and cleaves the hoof, and cleaves the cleft into two claws, and chews the cud among the beasts, that shall you eat. It goes through the things, again, the basic principles that we have already gone through. And in verse 21, they were told, you shall not eat of anything that dies of itself. You know, this is speaking of a clean animal. So here's an additional thing. They were also told, they were given permission that in that category, that it was permissible, that if some of the Gentiles who dwelt among them wanted it, they were permitted to let them have it, but they were not to eat of it themselves. That they could pass it on, but not the unclean. Or this referred to clean animals that died of themselves. So an animal was to be properly slaughtered. Now, as we come on here, we find that there are more instructions. We find clean and unclean meats. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 17, and let's put together various various laws relating physical laws of clean and unclean in terms of food that we're to eat. Leviticus 17, in verse 10, it says, whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel or of the strangers that sojourn among you that eats any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. The life of the flesh is in the blood. I've given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. It is the blood that makes an atonement. No soul shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourns among you eat blood. So, goes on, verse 13 says, if you're out hunting, and you catch a beast or a fowl that may be eaten, verse 13, you shall even pour out the blood thereof and cover it with dust. So, on down in verse 14, you shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh. The life of all flesh is the blood thereof. And verse 15, every soul that eats that which died of itself, or that which was torn by beasts, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening, and he shall be clean. So they were not to eat something that had died of itself, or something that had been, they'd come upon that had been killed by animals. They were not to eat the blood. God did not design blood to be eaten by human beings, and He used it to illustrate something very important, very sacred. So the fact that the blood was not to be consumed. Now, also there are other principles that relate in there as well. That when you come to the matter of fat, back in Leviticus chapter 7. Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 22. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, you shall eat no manner of fat, of ox or of sheep or of goat, the fat of the beast that dies of itself, the fat of that which is torn with beast, may be used in any other use, but you shall in no wise eat of it. So it could be utilized, in the making of soap or something of that sort. Tallow could. It could be used for candles, could be used for a variety of things, but it was not to be used to be eaten. Whosoever eats the fat, verse 25, of the beast, of which men offer an offering made by fire, that soul shall be cut off from his people. You shall eat no manner of blood, verse 26, whether it be a fowl or beast in any of your dwelling. Now, if you notice, the fat that they were not to eat was the fat of mammals, fat of oxen, sheep, or goats. There was not the prohibition against the fat of poultry. Chicken fat, in that sense, was not prohibited. The Jews have never understood that it was, that chicken fat could be utilized in cooking or something of that sort, though there may, because of cutting back on calories or things of that sort, we may want to take that off, but that is not biblically prohibited. But the fat of cattle or sheep or goats or things of that sort are. And all blood, whether it is fowl or beast. Verse 26, you're to eat no manner of blood, the fowl or the beast. So you can utilize the fat of the fowl, but not the blood of anything. So again, we see a little bit more that is spelled out. We see that we're not to eat the fat of mammals. We're not to utilize blood in terms of food. We're not to eat something that dies of itself or that was killed and torn by wild animals, even if it's a clean animal. You don't know how, from a health standpoint, you don't know how long the thing is laid there. A lot of things you don't know about it. And God just said, no, you don't do that. Certainly we're not to eat the flesh of unclean animals. Now let's go on a little further. There are other laws concerning sanitation and cleanliness that we find particularly we find many of them here in the book of Deuteronomy, coming on back in chapter 12, laws pertaining to motherhood. Now, we find two different things that come to be involved here. We find that there are matters of health. There's obviously a health basis, but many of these laws also have a ceremonial aspect because they involve coming in to the tabernacle or to the temple and offering a certain offering to make an atonement and to various things that were to be done in terms of the ceremonial priesthood. So clearly that aspect does not apply. But the fact that when it says that you have to understand when it said that a woman who's conceived a child, born a man-child, in Leviticus 12:2, that she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation for her infirmity, shall she be unclean. And in the 8th day, the child is to be circumcised. Now, what did it mean to be unclean? That just meant that you weren't to go out in public. You couldn't come into the tabernacle. Basically, the practical effect was that stay home and rest and a lot of young women engender a lot of health problems later on in life because they get up and around doing too much too soon after a child is born, and they may not feel it then, but I've had many older women make the point to me over the years that a lot of health problems that they had in later years they traced back to some of the things some of the work they did and the things they did right after childbirth. Well, the principle that God gave here was basically stay down and out of commission for a week, and then the 8th day, then they could bring the child in to be circumcised. Well, a little baby doesn't need to be out and be exposed and in any sort of public setting right away. There are ceremonial aspects, but you're looking at physical principles of sanitation and hygiene. And then there was a continuation of just in verse 44 that where it primarily has to do with the fact that there's a continuing discharge from a woman for a period of time, that takes place. It mentions here, she continues in the blood of her purifying 33 days. Well, if you add 33 and 7, that's 40 days. Normally a doctor will talk about 6 weeks. Well, how long is 6 weeks? 42 days. So that's basically what God said all along. Medical science finally, 20th century, they say certain matters, but the fact that there's before, let's say, full normal activity resumes and marital activity resumes, that there is a period of time that takes place. And while this is tied in with a ceremonial aspect, there's also a very practical, physical aspect that comes out. On down in chapter 13, it has to do with certain of the health laws that, in terms of contagious diseases, some of the skin diseases, it talks about a plague of leprosy, which is not exactly what we think of as leprosy today. It was an infectious or contagious skin disease. And chapter 13 and 14 goes on in to much of that, and it simply goes through the instructions to the priesthood as to how they were to recognize something that was contagious from something that wasn't. And they were in the role of public health officials. And again, this is something that we don't have a Levitical priesthood that's functioning, but just here were principles that they were given based on, physical laws. The priest, verse 3 of Leviticus 13, was to look on the plague in the skin of the flesh. And when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of the flesh, it is the plague of leprosy. This is something that is serious, when it is coming in, that the flesh is appearing to rot away and the hair is changing color. If that, it goes on in verse 4, if the bright spot be white in the skin of the flesh, but it's not deeper than the skin, it's not something that is eating away at the skin, and the hair is not turned white, then the priest keeps him in quarantine for 7 days and checks it over again. And the basic principle that God gave Israel in terms of health laws were laws of sanitation and hygiene and quarantine. If somebody appears to have an infectious disease, you keep them isolated until you know for sure. If somebody comes in contact with something that is contaminated, they are designated as unclean for a period of time. That just means that they are in some level of isolation. They're not free to just come in contact with everything and everyone until the matter is resolved. That when something has become unclean, that it needs to be washed, needs to be cleaned up. We find that certain kinds of garments that have been contaminated or have talks about certain kinds of mold and certain kinds of things where garments were certain cloth was to be destroyed, was to be burned, because again the tendency of contagion and things to spread. You have to realize that we're looking in a society where water was sometimes a scarce commodity and was certainly inconvenient to utilize many times. And so if the details weren't spelled out, people didn't do it. This is what's happening right now in Sudan and many of these areas where they bring them in, they bring the refugee camps, and the Red Cross is feeding them, and they're getting something to eat, but they're still dying. Because contamination and disease just spreads through everything. So you have all of these things that are done, and on through chapter 14 and chapter 15, that deal with matters of, physical things. It certainly deals even with the matter of marital relations and the matter of a woman's monthly cycle, that God gave certain prohibitions there. And the specifics that are gone through here in terms of of clean and unclean. And there are many different things that relate very clearly to clean and unclean, the things that are not to be not to be utilized. So we find over and over that God lays a great emphasis on matters of sanitation, matters of hygiene, and these things these things are there. We find much of this is given in the book of Leviticus. Some of it is also detailed back in the book of Deuteronomy as well, and as to the way that some of these things were to be done. Chapter 23 of the book of Deuteronomy deals specifically here with the people when they're encamped, and it talks about uncleanness in verse 10. If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness, the chances him by night, he shall go abroad out of the camp, he shall not come within the camp, but it shall be when evening comes on, he will wash himself with water, and the sun has gone down, he shall come into the camp again. If you want to find out when the evening is, it's when the sun goes down. Some have been confusion here. Just make a comment. Some have been confused about when is evening. The Sabbath, we observe the Sabbath from evening to evening. Some have been confused. Was it sunset or total darkness? Well, we never used to be confused. Mr. Armstrong was never confused on the matter. But it spells it out right here. It says in verse 11, it shall be when evening comes on, he shall wash himself with water, and when the sun is down, he'll come into the camp again. Over and over you see that evening, that you're unclean until evening. Well, when is evening? When the sun goes down. So the Bible defines its own terms, You don't have to go to some great, get every the Jewish rabbis. This isn't the Talmud. The Talmud, if I had the volumes of the Talmud, they'd fill up this table. This is just a sort of a little summary of some of the things. That's the kind of stuff that you get from the Jewish rabbis. That's what they've come up with. The Bible is simple and defines its own terms. So evening and sunset are made very plain here. Deuteronomy 23:11. That wasn't the main point that I was making, but verse 12 says, "You shall have a place without the camp. They shall go forth abroad. They'll have a paddle upon their weapon. It'll be when you ease yourself abroad, you dig therewith and turn back and cover that which comes from you." Well, now that's a pretty simple elemental thing, but you consider the fact that disease epidemics are sweeping through, again, everywhere from Mexico to a lot of these third world countries, because raw sewage is out there in the ditches and dumped in the streets. People, just incredible. God says, look, you go out to get away from where everybody else is, and you cover it up with dirt. It's not just lying out there exposed. Very elemental, basic laws. Now, we take most of these things for granted because our society here in the United States is geared to where soap and water is pretty cheap, and we have indoor plumbing, and we've got a lot of conveniences, and it's very convenient to be more sanitary than what often people have been in the past. I don't think it's been fully appreciated how much of a difference has been made in terms of the rise in let's say the increase of age, the number of people surviving till later in life, the decline of the death rate. I don't think that it has been fully appreciated how much of that in the 20th century is attributable, is probably more than any other factor to the increase in sanitation and hygiene. Apart from all of the things man's medical science has done, just laws of sanitation and hygiene go a long way to reducing just the spread of plagues and infectious diseases. And if you add in the principle of quarantine, you notice that God primarily gave Israel matters. He focused in preventative areas. He focused in on diet, certain things to be eaten, certain things to be avoided. He focused in on sanitation, on being hygienic, being clean in all aspects of life, of bathing, of washing clothes, washing utensils, of when something became unclean, that it had to be cleansed. You realize that one of the greatest problems that existed, and this was as late as the 1860s, the American War between the states, that battlefield surgeons would go from one soldier to another, just wiping their knife on their breeches and go on to the next one, and that plague and disease just spread through the camps. That killed far more died of infection than died of the actual wound. It was just a lack of sanitation and hygiene. When you go through and you take these principles, you realize that when blood touched something, it became unclean and it had to be washed. Well, if the battlefield physicians of centuries past had just practiced that one principle, think how many lives would have been saved. A lot of these things are very basic, but God reveals physical principles, and some of them are maybe very basic, but particularly the ones about clean and unclean meats, people still don't regard. I mean, maybe the doctor tells people, well, you shouldn't be eating all these fats, bad for your blood pressure, and pork causes various problems and things of that sort. But, people don't pay a whole lot of attention to that. But God gives those principles, various physical laws that are brought out. Now, there are other physical principles as well that come out that also tie in as far as just even the matter of how that let's say the ecology and man's relationship with the environment that is spelled out, and this sort of thing is spelled out and detailed. That we find that, for instance, back in we find some of it here in the book of Deuteronomy, and we find some of it back in Leviticus. That in Deuteronomy 22, in verse 6, says, if a bird's nest chance to be before you in the way, in any tree or in the ground, whether there be young ones or eggs, or the dam sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, you shall not take the dam with the young. You shall in any wise let the dam go and take the young to you. It may be well with you that you may prolong your days. Now, here's a very simple principle of the ecology, that this is talking about the fact that you don't. What, of course, would happen when you if you come on a bird's nest and you kill the mother bird and you maybe take the eggs or take the young. Well, it won't be long. You don't have any birds. That's if you kill the young and you kill the mother, you're going to wipe out a species. And so here was a tendency of people. God just said, look, you're coming through. Don't you're out plowing or something like that. Don't kill the mother and the young or the eggs. If you disturb the nest, let the mother go. And that way there'll be other young birds, and you will prolong your days. He says, verse 28, and this in many ways was a civil statute, but he just said, you make a new house, make a battlement for your roof. Here was Here was a matter that they usually had flat roofs. He said, build a railing. Build a railing around it. Don't want somebody falling off and getting killed. Verse 9, you're not to sow your vineyard with diverse seeds, lest the fruit of your seed which you have sown and the fruit of the vineyard be defiled. This had to do with an improper mixing of seeds. Certain things will cross, and God emphasized purity. He emphasized purity, and not just the degeneration that takes place when things are allowed to cross in that way. So he said, verse 10, don't plow the ox and the ass together. You shall not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen. Now, woolen and linen have to do with animal and vegetable fiber mixed together. You mix a lot of the synthetics. Normally, the synthetics are made to where they match with and are used with either the vegetable fiber or the animal fiber. Linen or cotton is more commonly used by us as vegetable fiber, and woolen, of course, as an animal fiber. God said, just as a matter of a principle here, that was not something that ought to normally be mixed. He emphasized, again, that principle back in Leviticus 19. Verse 19, he says, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle gender with a diverse kind. You shall not sow your field with mingled seed, neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon you. Well, these were physical matters. There's not certainly the principle of purity that is emphasized. God designed certain things in a certain way, but primarily physical matters that were that were involved. You have various other principles that are brought out as well. As far as let's just notice in Deuteronomy 20 the principles that tied in. Deuteronomy 20, verse 19. When you shall besiege a city a long time in making war against it, you shall not destroy the trees thereof by forcing an axe against them, that you may eat thereof, and you shall not cut them down. For the tree of the field is man's life, to employ them in the siege. Only the trees which you know, that they be not trees for meat, you shall destroy and cut them down. You shall build bulwarks against the city that makes war with you until it be subdued. So here again, God just gave a principle. You're going in, even if you're involved in a warfare. You don't just involve yourself in a wanton destruction of the land. You don't just destroy the crops and destroy the trees there. The trees, particularly, takes decades for them to grow and really get on up where they're productive. And to just come in and just cut them down in a wanton way is foolish, and it's destructive of the environment. So again, many of these physical principles, some of it carries through in terms of civil regulation, in terms of ceremonial regulation, and in terms of in their even spiritual overtones on many of these things. It's not simply a matter of being able to, it's not simply a matter of being able to go through and clearly divide out or make a distinction between all the various categories of law. But the point is that God orders His creation. God is the creator, and He orders His creation. And so He set in motion laws of the way things ought to function. And some of those simply apply to the physical environment around us. That man was given lordship, he was given dominion, but he was given instruction. That he is to be considerate. He's to be considerate of the animals. That We'll cover some of these later in civil statutes, but, he was told that if he saw an animal that, even if it belonged to his neighbor, that was hurt or injured or stuck in a ditch or something, he was to get it out. He was to show consideration to the animals. He was to, aim toward purity and toward quality, whether it was in the way that he planned his field and sowed his seed, or the way he bred his livestock. That he was to take care in that way and to respect the basic distinctions that God has made and has designed in. And certainly the most important aspect of the physical laws in terms of the impact on human beings are all of the laws relating to clean and unclean, sanitation and hygiene. And we see all these principles that come through that God regulates all the aspects of His creation. And the relationship of man and his environment are regulated by physical laws of the around. Next time we will go a little further into other aspects of God's law and its application for us today.